What on earth was IBM thinking? Today on Dinty's Hideaway. In 1977, when the Apple, Tandy, and Commodore computers became the first wave of American consumer PCs and became an instant hit, computer behemoth IBM wanted to get in the mix. 1979 saw a second wave of PC introductions. Texas Instruments, Atari, and Motorola designed the Tandy color computer, and it came out. IBM was suffering from a severe case of FOMO, fear of missing out, and did a very non-IBM thing. Bought parts, software from outsiders, and rushed the product to market. That gamble worked because they were developing and building a PC as far from IBM's New York headquarters as possible in Boca Raton, Florida. The IBM Personal PC, or PC, was the biggest hit they'd had since that typewriter with little ball, the Selectric. And pricing was competitive too. Sure, the high-end prices were high, but you could get a model with a tape drive, RF modulator to use at a TV, and 64K for the cost of a similarly equipped Apple II. But that was not the market that embraced the PC. Instead, IBM's core small and mid-business customers made up the bulk of the orders, at least in the US. The PC was available retail at Computerland, but otherwise only through IBM dealers. The consumer market, while hungry for their products, just could not function under the IBM sales model. IBM, for example, had no tech support and warranty support supplied only by dealers. So the PC became super popular. But so did the Compact that came later. One can only guess what the folks at IBM's marketing department were thinking, but it became clear that the average Sears buyer would not buy an IBM. Looking around at some international models, IBM decided the best course would be to make a machine more proprietary and bundle an expensive color monitor with it. The other thing they really thought we needed to change was that expensive keyboard that came with the PC. You know, we consumers don't really like to type much anyway, and we like wireless consumery looking things like a TV remote. So IBM gave us that. And all this for just several times more expensive than the average home computer. Also, us consumers don't really look to build quality the same way business customers do, so they farmed out the manufacturing, thinking we'd never notice. The PC Junior became a textbook example of a terrible product. The launch missed its mark entirely, and even though it had intentionally made it harder to copy, Radio Shack had the Tandy 1000 out within a few months, and built their whole PC business in the back of the PC Junior. The IBM PC and XTs both sold well, but the AT with its slow speed and high price did not, and while the market exploded, IBM saw only a modest sales increase. IBM was used to being the only choice, and now it was playing catch-up. IBM didn't like being in that position. With all the profits coming from the initial sale only, they had to think fast. First, they bought Lotus 123, a popular spreadsheet program, and introduced their own operating system, and they called it OS2. Gotta give them points for originality there. Anyway, many from IBM found companies like Microsoft and Intel to be disloyal, selling their wares to whatever Tom, Dick, and Harry came along, so IBM set a course for corporate suicide, or maybe just self-mutilation, but anyway, it was dumb. Intel was a special case. Intel licensed its 386 chip architecture to just two companies, IBM and AMD. In the case of IBM, it was so they could make more efficient versions to run in their sub-notebooks that were just becoming a thing. But they kind of took liberties. They took the 386 chip design and started selling a chip outside their own machines and called it the SLC 386, or Smart Little Chip. In 1982, at the behest of IBM, who did not want a single supplier controlling the heart of its PCs, insisted that Intel license the 286 to a second supplier. AMD was a logical choice as its founder and Intel's founders already knew each other as they'd worked together at Fairchild Semiconductor. The agreement was that AMD could use the Intel architecture to make some clone chips for 10 years. AMD not only had to pay a licensing fee, but share their chip technology for the benefit of Intel. In other words, they both had to play nice. But Intel didn't play nice and licensed its 286 chip to literally everyone, many of whom made pretty crappy copies. But the 386 chip, which also was licensed to IBM, was another story. In 1987, Intel was looking for a way out of their partnership with AMD, and ended the agreement stating that AMD did not hold up to their end with developing new technologies. This served as a devastating blow as cloning Intel chips had become its main business. IBM continued to release its as 386 SLC, which were 8386 SX chips with double the L1 cache. In 1990, two guys named Mike Webb checked into the Sunnyvale Hilton. One worked for Intel, the other AMD. Now by this time, Intel and AMD had become sworn enemies, but since the two companies were physically close to each other, two Mike Webbs were both staying at the same hotel across from the AMD campus. Both Mike Webbs eventually checked out, but a package arrived for Mike Webb after. The hotel, assuming the package was for the Intel Mike Webb, sent over the package. In the package were the marketing materials for a new chip called the AM386, which of course was news to Intel. It was pretty clear that AMD was trying to confuse prospective Intel buyers into believing AMD still was allowed to make its 386 clones. Intel attempted to get a court to make them stop using the 386 name, but the court and many subsequent courts all said the same thing.
Answer the question. Why don't you please be quiet, sir?
A number is not a name, and you cannot trademark a number. This started a feeding frenzy as a 486 chip was using a number and was also the latest technology. No one could legally copy the chip exactly, but AMD pretty much did that anyway, as did a number of European companies, where there were less aggressive rules concerning those things. Now, there were a number of companies who made chips and called them the 486, including Cyrix, their licensee Texas Instruments, but the most egregious was IBM. They took their SL3 386 chip, which was really a 386 with doubled cache, and called it a 486. With a 16-bit architecture and the inability to use local bus graphics or drives, this was seen as extremely deceptive by the computer press, who tried to crucify IBM. But IBM had sold equipment to Hitler during World War II, and he'd come back from that, so this would be easy. IBM doubled down on the deceptive practices and introduced 32-bit chips that were nearly identical to Intel's 486 chips and called them Blue Lightning. They did carry some advantages over the standard 386. For example, all the IBM and Ambra machines had XGA video, which allowed for 256 colors at 1024 by 768 resolution. And the IBM models came with a generous 8 megabytes of system RAM and a 72-pin configuration, which was good as the less reliable 30-pin modules were falling out of fashion. It would appear that IBM conceding their PS2 microchannel architecture and integrated SCSI support were never going to displace the industry standard architecture, or ISA, and its local bus cousin, the Video Electronic Standards Association, or VESA. Ambra allowed them to do this without losing face. The license from Intel only allowed IBM to use the SLC chips as integrated on a system board. The retail SLC boards only supported 30-pin SIMs and VGA graphics. This whole foray, all this effort, the millions spent on lawyers, and after less than 2 years, IBM gave up on the idea of making the chip to go on their PC machines. In typical IBM fashion, they disrupted the industry and then just shut it down. But this, unbeknownst to them, would be the final time they'd ever be able to do this. What IBM had done was disrupt the bottom of the market, pushing buyers upmarket to mail order. During this same period, Gateway 2000 and Xeos were already offering off-brand Occidental computer systems, with CompuAdd deciding to offer the cheaper IBM chips. IBM had a long relationship with CompuAdd. They purchased the original PC manufacturing facility from IBM and used the SLC and Blue Lightning chips, even as they were chided for doing so. But IBM could do due diligence to buy CompuAdd, but they couldn't do it in time to make the lower-end PCs under the CompuAdd brand. The company had collapsed and the deal became impossible. Minnesota-based Xeos was another excellent choice, but by the time IBM came calling, they were already in talks to be bought up by Micron as a result of the losses caused by their move to retail. Iowa-based Gateway 2000 was just shipping its millionth PC and would be expensive. Plus, they had other suitors, namely Compaq, and IBM wanted to avoid a bidding war. Really, IBM had missed the mark entirely in the U.S. consumer market. AST and Packard Bell at the low end, and Micron and Gateway 2000 and Dell at the high end, with hundreds of soon-to-be bankrupt white box manufacturers in the middle. IBM didn't want to cheapen their own brand, as they were still making 50% margins on PCs, compared to AST's less than 10. But what about manufacturing? For years now, IBM had been suffering under the low cost of Taiwanese clones. Tatung was the most established Taiwanese company, which was started in 1918. IBM had been using their parts since before the PC even existed. It only made sense, however, for IBM to take advantage of the lower costs in Taiwan. The perception that everything made there was cheap and mass-produced was quickly going away. IBM knew they would have to develop relationships there to stay relevant. Multitech was already making computers for Sears under the Franklin brand and for TI. They had even begun exporting to compete machines in the US market under their own brand name, Acer. IBM was so used to being right and always making money, they were definitely drinking the blue flavored Kool-Aid on this one. So in 1992, they started a mail-order company in Europe. Now I have personal experience with this, and I can tell you this is not an easy task. In fact, Gateway 2000 would fail at this, and CompuAdd already had. In Europe, the overhead of using a dealer was cost prohibitive. Commodore just told everybody to be exclusive and sold to everyone else anyway. So the entire European retail computer community would shine a jaundiced eye on any computer company to come calling. The only real choice was to do direct market. But this is before the European unions. There were language, currency, and regulatory issues to contend with, which were more expensive. And then there were labor laws and leasing laws designed to keep them from leaving a country once they'd open an office there. In Ireland, for example, labor and leases were cheap, but you had to pay your employees a year's wages when they left. France was more or less set up to make it impossible for any American company to compete there. Spain and Portugal were needlessly bureaucratic, and Italy and Greece politically unstable. Central and Northern Europe had ridiculous health and safety requirements. So in 1992, the first PC was shipped in Europe. In 1993 in the US, IBM had shot for what they thought was a small, conservative 10% market share. But the US version of the Ambra was entirely different. The Inselden side sticker was replaced with a giant 486, embossed in the upper left-hand corner of the case. And the 486 SLC2 and 3, which was really a 2.25, were the CPUs on offer. Gone was a local video. After all, these were really 386 machines, and still no standard multimedia, even though the vast majority sold would get that added. The irony of this whole situation was IBM began using these same SLC chips in many of their entry-level PS2 machines. Why? Because institutional and big business buyers did not read the articles about what a ripoff it was. Also, IBM had begun a big dump of its chips in the white box market at about the same time the Ambra PC came out in Europe. So by the time it premiered in the States, the SLC had already been perceived as down market from the mail-order retailers. The only big company offering it was CompuAdd, who would soon be bankrupt. Strangely, the competition from Cyrix was considered upmarket of the IBM SLC. Compaq and other companies would begin offering value PCs with those chips, but never the IBM. At one point, IBM had developed a 46 clock tripled processor with an integrated numeric processor called the IBM Blue Lightning 75, but that lasted for only a few months. After all, anyone wanting a premium experience should buy an IBM branded machine. This is more for the great unwashed. In spite of that, IBM had made the first clock tripled CPU, beating AMD's DX4 to the punch. And just as they did with the PC Junior, IBM missed the mark entirely, retiring Ambra after just a year in the US. Not only had they not even gotten 1/100th of their conservative market share goal, but no one had even heard of Ambra. For the Pentium Windows 95 generation of machines, IBM introduced its Aptiva and sold at a 50% premium and continued to be dumbfounded by their poor sales numbers. Within just a few years, after continuing to introduce down-market machines like the Net Vista, IBM had come to the realization that they were no longer going to be a maker of PCs. Gateway 2000, Compaq, and Dell had now permanently stolen their core market, a deserving end to an arrogant era. Today we see the same type of behavior with companies like Tesla and Apple. IBM tried that hardware service model in the 60s, and it worked for a while too. IBM made a superior premium product, but to say their prices were a little high was like trying to sell a Mercedes to a Kia customer. Today, with the retro computer community praising IBM for innovation and quality, it's truly hard to imagine an era with such price gouging. Don't believe me? Look it up on your $1,000 iPhone.